Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative question of how politics could appear in our preaching this week. My name's Naomi, and I'm a Methodist minister in the North Kent Circuit. Today, we are delighted to have two guests, Simon Hall and Charlotte Naylor Davis. Hello, Simon and Charlotte.
Hello.
Hi.
Charlotte is a part-time minister and academic based in Leeds. Her church community, Revive, is a small community meeting in houses. Teaching is discursive and inclusive, meaning it's often challenging, but valuing everyone's voice in the room. She has a PhD in biblical studies, specifically Bible translation, and research expertise in the history of interpretation of biblical texts, particularly in subcultures, and from the hermeneutical perspective of gender and disability. She's also the president of the International Society of Metal Music Studies and writing a book on the Bible in heavy metal culture. She has ME, so doing any of these things takes 3 times as long as healthy people, but Revive are very kind and let her be herself. That's how she came to be doing a podcast with Simon on sex and church this last year. Simon is a Baptist minister who divides his time between supporting pioneering, podcasting with Charlotte at A God We Could Believe In, and as part of the Northumbrian Collective, and writing a graphic novel about St. George and English nationalism. He lives in Leeds with his wife Anna, a TV documentarian. And joining us from JPIT today is Erica Lee Smith, JPIT's communications intern and producer of the podcast. Hello, Erica.
Hiya.
Mm.
So, Charlotte and Simon, I'd love to start by asking you the question that we ask a lot of our guests. Does politics belong in the pulpit? Simon, would you like to start?
Yes, I'm a Baptist minister, which means everything I say takes about 25 to 40 minutes. So I'll have to give you the very short version, which is uh, if life belongs in the pulpit, if we believe that in some way God is calling us to incarnate the gospel, then yes, of course, politics belongs in the pulpit.
Yes, I would hardly agree.
That was impressively concise. Yes, Charlotte, you were saying.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I think, like I say, I come from a biblical studies background, and the Bible, in its context, is political. Its construction is political. Its interpretation has been political. How it's used is political. And so I think if people out there in politics are allowed to use our texts to talk about their issues, then we should be talking about their issues in our spaces. And so, yeah, absolutely. I find it hard to take the politics out of any of the ways that I think or do things, to be honest, when it comes to preaching or teaching. So, yeah.
Mm. I find that such a helpful way of looking at it, that the Bible is being used in other spaces to prop up particular perspectives. So within the spaces that we have some kind of control over, we should absolutely be talking about those issues.
Yeah.
That's really helpful. Thank you. So, just to set the context, we are, as you can possibly tell, recording this podcast during the heat wave.
Mm-hmm.
So, one of the headlines at the moment, we're British, so we love to talk about the weather, is the weather. And the record has just been set for the hottest May night in the UK.
Oh,
The US has struck Iranian missile sites during the ongoing peace talks. Doctors have said that social media is as bad for young people as smoking. And Benjamin Netanyahu has said that Israel will intensify the strikes against Hezbollah in Lebanon. We're looking today at the lectionary readings for Sunday, the 7th of June. So we're looking at Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 9, Psalm 33, verses 1 to 12, Romans chapter 4, verses 13 to 25, and Matthew chapter 9, verses 9 to 13 and 18 to 26. There's several relevant awareness days. It's Pride Month. There's also World Environment Day on the 5th of June, Environment Sunday on the 7th of June, the Great Big Green Week from the 6th to the 14th of June, and World Oceans Day on the 8th of June. So with all of that in mind, let's have a look at the texts. And I think we're going to start today in the Hebrew Bible. So, Simon, I think you've had some thoughts about our Genesis passage. Would you like to share those?
Yes. When I got sent the passages, I must admit, when I saw this passage, I did have a minor panic attack because obviously this passage right now in our time and history is an incredibly political passage. If we if we think of the notion of Israel, that word, uh, and if Israel identifies itself as a superhero in history, then this is its origin story. This is the moment that Peter Parker, an ordinary young teenager, is bitten by a radioactive spider and turns into Spider-Man. It's an absolute hammer proof text of the claims of a particular group of people to a particular land. So I must admit, this felt like a radioactive spider to me in terms of how we might handle this text, because I'm sure for most of us preaching, we will have folk in our congregations that will hear this passage in a very direct and presently applicable way, that this is evidence that the current nation of Israel has divine right to the land of Palestine. So I want to give a little bit of context to this to those who might be brave enough to address this passage. Historically, we believe that the book of Genesis was put together during the period of the exile, or perhaps in the early years of the post-exilic period. It's a group of people who have been utterly defeated, devastated, destroyed. This passage, the very creation of what we call the Hebrew Bible, we might call a response to trauma, a process of making meaning and finding a reason to continue when everything is lost. And therefore, if we read this passage from the perspective of power, of empire, we are not really hearing it the way that it would first have been heard. A group of people a long way from home being given a reason to live, a reason to continue. And this is a story about someone who comes to the land that God has promised to them, and they just live there. They 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 perform their acts of worship. They create altars, but they don't invade. They don't do violence. They sit and they wait for God's promise to be fulfilled. So I think there's a challenge there in terms of those of us who read it from a position of power and those of us who read it from a position of weakness too. Because the challenge is, can we trust God's plans and purposes to come to fruition without our desperate need to intervene on God's behalf?
Mm.
Mm.
Thank you very much. Charlotte, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I didn't know what Simon was going to say, and I'm just thinking about that. I think that point about power is so important because we often are reading the Bible from a completely different context than the one in which it was written, and we assume we understand or we can relate to a particular character, but actually they're not in the position that we were in. I think the message of endurance is quite interesting, of staying in the land and doing the things and just continuing in belief. And that gets picked up in the Romans 4 passage. I don't know if you want to jump there yet, but you said, Simon, they don't invade or anything. And actually the very next verse in the context of Genesis 12 is not only do they not invade, the land gets a famine, and so they leave.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And they go to be refugees. They reside as aliens in Egypt and have to throw themselves on the help of others. So all the way through these kind of passages with Abraham, you get this interaction between being the person of the promise and the person who needs help. And those things play with one another, don't they? They go in and out. And I think that's quite interesting as well, that this it isn't a story of domination at this point in Genesis 12, because the very
Mm.
next moment is one of vulnerability. And we have to hold both of those things. If we're going to talk about power, we have to talk about weakness at the same time and how that turns up.
I think it's fascinating that here at the dawn of this promise, which I think it might have been written just as people return, because it mentions particular places. You know, it mentions a particular tree, which people hundreds of miles away probably wouldn't know. You know, there's a story that's really about the geography, but this call is to be a blessing. It's not a
Mm.
call to defeat others.
Yeah.
And a challenge throughout history is those that have been oppressed, when they gain power, how do they then use that power? And I think if we hear this as God's promise to a people who have lost their land, who have lost almost lost their identity,
Mm.
their call is not just to inhabit a land, but to be a blessing to those who have oppressed them,
Mm.
which to me is a very Christ-like call right there at the beginning of the story of Israel and Judah.
Mm. Yes, I think there's something really interesting there in what you're both sharing about. We often read these Bible stories and we're in a completely different place from the people whose stories are. And that made me think we're more in the position of the Canaanites in many ways as we read this
Mhm.
story. In terms of our national discourse, there's such at the moment about migration and people being very upset and fearful about people migrating into the UK. But this, as one of our foundational stories, is about God saying to a group of people, go from your home, move to a completely different land where there are people already, and then, as you say, Charlotte, do life there and be a blessing in that place. And I find that fascinating. And in some ways, as a nation and in terms of the conversations we're having at the moment, we're more from the perspective of the group of people who are dealing with those people coming and migrating into the country, doing life, seeking to be a blessing, and how do we respond? And
Mm.
that's fascinating. Erica, did you have anything you wanted to share about Genesis?
Yeah, I mean, you've all covered a lot of the things that came to my head and more. But I definitely the themes around migration stood out to me. And the sense of immigration being a blessing, which you can kind of take from this as well. And it definitely links to some of the stuff that we've been doing recently with JPIT on the refugee family reunion campaign. When you look at a passage like this, which is, you know, it's talking about the families and everyone from the country leaving, and there is definitely a sense of them like sticking together as a blessing. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of reinforce that line really.
Mm. Mm. Yes, this feels like the moment where that biblical narrative begins of Israel are always called to have compassion and understanding towards foreigners, towards migrants, towards outsiders, because they've been in that position themselves. And that's such a foundational part
Mm, mm.
of their identity, our identity. Thank you. Charlotte, you already started drawing on the parallels, the links with Romans, which is really helpful. Simon, did you have any thought about that connection?
Well, only Charlotte can help us. It feels crazy for me to say much, but obviously this passage uses words like believing, believing in, faith, faithful, faithfulness. It's a bit of a kind of word salad. We don't quite have the right English words, but Paul is somehow saying that Abraham's faithful uh, trust and living out this promise, which, as Charlotte has said, the first uh, kind of practical outworking of this promise is that they have to leave the land. So it requires a lot of faith and faithfulness. And Paul likens that to the faith and faithfulness that we need to have today, and that indeed that is where salvation comes from. And unfortunately, that word is a very narrow, thin word as we use it, because we think it's just a ticket to heaven. But God's salvation comes to us through our own faith and faithfulness. Charlotte, you can now give the right answer to that.
Yeah. It's funny, Romans. I was thinking like as an arc. I don't use the lectionary, so it was interesting for me to have to like delve into four things at this like together. It's interesting that Psalm 33 has like God will basically confound the nations and their plots, right? Which I thought was interesting in light of the Genesis passage. You think you can take this one passage and say this is how nations should be, but then later on the psalmist is just like, look, God owns everything and the nations are up in the air. Romans 4, I would say I don't often preach on Romans unless I'm in a series on Romans. My encouragement to everyone would be, if you're finding Romans hard as a book, that's because Romans is really hard to understand as a book. It's not us lacking, it's that Paul is very complex in Romans. And the language sort of builds up. And so when you take a Romans passage out, it can often feel quite kind of abrupt and you can end up going down strange alleys. So that's my kind of caveat for Romans is make sure you look around the passage at what's going on. What's interesting here, I think, is that people focus on verse 23. The words reckoned to him were not written for his sake alone, but for ours also. It will be reckoned to us who believe in him who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead, who was handed over for our trespasses. And we get very focused on, and therefore faith and belief and this kind of linking of them, and you just need to believe in Jesus and it'll be reckoned to you as righteousness. But what's interesting about this passage for me is that Paul's example of what belief is, this reckoning, this thing that gets reckoned to Abraham as belief, is his life following God. It's his constant turning up for God. So he gives all these examples of Abraham hoping, of Abraham kind of not worrying about his own body that's already as good as dead. It doesn't make him distrust. It's a long-term process. And we've focused a lot, I think, in lots of different ways in salvation theology on the moment of belief, or the idea of a kind of post-enlightenment, I assent to this belief in God, that kind of declaration. Do I believe in God? Yes, I do. But Paul's example is Abraham. And his examples are Abraham's long life of living faith, not one moment where Abraham made a decision. He doesn't just, he doesn't go back and use just kind of the sacrifice of Isaac, for example. He talks about this long life. And I think that's really interesting from a political point of view. We're talking about politics in the pulpit. What is it to be a believer? What is it to have things reckoned to us as righteousness by God? It's living the ways of God throughout our lives, in our land, in our spaces, trying to figure out what God would do, hoping against hope that God can make a difference, keeping going. And I think that's really important for me in this kind of context. We've got to be doing, and we've got to be living it, not just believing it. So that's where I'll start. And I'll let other people talk for a moment.
Oh, I love that, the perseverance and the persistence that requires. And for me, there's something really interesting in the fact that Paul says, no distrust made him waver according to the promise of God. But actually, Abraham does waver, and there are moments where he does think, oh no, I must have got this wrong. That obviously the whole situation with Hagar and with Ishmael, Abraham feeling the need to take that into his own hands because God doesn't seem to be fulfilling the promise in a timely fashion. So something about how we persist and keep showing up and persevere, even though sometimes we'll wobble and we'll get things wrong, but then we keep on going, and it's that life with all its ups and downs that matters, not one specific moment in that life. That's really helpful. Erica, what did you make of the Romans passage?
Yeah, I think definitely the hoping against hope thing is sort of key to a lot of our campaigns work and being involved in politics or activism in general at this moment in time. And I've been thinking about this quite a lot, particularly in my role this year, working with JPIT, about sort of the distinction of the Christian lens in politics or a faith lens even. And I think more and more that actually passages like this talking about, how much our faith can keep us going when things are tough. Um, Call us to be more idealistic about politics and optimistic.
Mm.
And I've had conversations with friends who really like don't quite get that, who are not Christian, and they're a much more kind of realistic approach to politics. And it's like, well, but we can change the system and we can make a difference. So I've found that passage quite reaffirming, I think, in the work that we do. But also I was thinking a bit about the relationship between faith and the law, particularly in terms of like non-violent direct action,
Mm.
and kind of how sometimes our faith calls us, to not necessarily conform to human systems, if they are not coming from a place of justice. And
Mm.
I think, that's also a really important aspect that I've been thinking about recently, particularly, with the arrest of Palestine Action protesters, and all of the headlines around that.
That's brilliant. It's great to have those really practical connections to the
Mm.
work that
Mm.
JPIT does and how that finds expression. That's great. We've mentioned the psalm really briefly, but Simon, did you have any other thoughts about the psalm that you wanted to share?
Just a couple of things. One is I I think the psalm represents, yes, it's about God's I think it's what Walter Brueggemann calls God's settled sovereignty. It's primarily, it's slightly sort of God's in his heaven and all's right with the world psalm. What Brueggemann calls the psalm of orientation. But it indicates something that as Christians engaged in politics, we have to remember, which is that overall, the scriptures have what you might call a hermeneutic of suspicion towards human leadership. And I'm told that there are about 1,000 religious and secular leaders mentioned in the Bible, and around 40 of them have something good said about them. And one of those is David, and it's fair to say that's a mixed report. Um, none of the kings of Israel have anything good said about them. Now, as I said, that's probably because the final version of the scriptures we have were edited by Jews and not Israelites. But it's worth remembering that if we are looking to a human to solve our problems, we're probably looking in the wrong place. The other thing for me, as someone who was converted into the charismatic movement and had many sort of deep and profound spiritual experiences within that, is just a reminder that we have some great things to sing about. And sometimes those of us who are more engaged, we might go to a political rally and find ourselves singing there in a way that we don't sing in church. And there's something there that we need to examine because the God that I believe in now, the Jesus that I follow now, is so beautiful and so lovely that I really want to sing about that with the community in my church. Now we could go into that in more detail, but it's just something to remember that singing is something, whether you think of it as natural or divine, it's something that brings us together, that gives us hope and joy and identity. And sometimes I think those of us who see ourselves as on the cold face and in the gritty part of life, we find ourselves not celebrating goodness, joy, justice, and peace in the way that I used to, celebrate being filled with the Holy Spirit.
Mm. Yes, thank you. Yes, sometimes it can almost feel too complicated to celebrate those things when you're aware of everything else.
Yeah.
But the everything else perhaps makes it even more important that we do celebrate and we do sing and we do come together behind a shared identity like that. So thank you. If we move on to the Matthew passage, Charlotte, with your academic background, I would just love to hear your thoughts on this passage.
Yeah, I've got one tiny note on Romans, and it's just a little warning. Is that if you're going to read this out loud, it's got this word barrenness in it. And I really think we need to get rid of that word from our Bibles. There's no need for it. It's very contextual, it's very judgmental of women who have not been able to or cannot or have chosen not to have children. And it's okay to use infertile or was unable to or could not carry or anything else. But barrenness is a really horrible political term that makes women's purpose being somehow a growth incubator for children. And it can really harm people in your community to hear that word if they're struggling with infertility and childlessness. So that's my one little kind of, let's just get rid of it, right? It's contextually relevant if you want to do a whole sermon and talk about patriarchy and women's bodies. Absolutely engage with it. But if you're not going to pick up on it and you haven't got time, because maybe you've got 20 minutes, you haven't got time to get into patriarchy and women's bodies, it's okay to just translate it differently. So I say that as a translation scholar. Just put a better word in that's less harmful to your community. That would be my one note on that.
That's really helpful.
So speaking of, the Matthew passage is interesting because we've got the both the calling of Matthew and this Jairus's daughter and the woman with the hemorrhage. The calling of Matthew with tax collectors and sinners. Why does Jesus help with them? And it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. And then a passage about the sick. So I thought that was quite an interesting pairing. We've taken the fasting out. We're just going to jump over a whole thing about fasting, and we're going to compare these two. The first thing politically I was thinking that's interesting about Jesus talking to tax collectors is that we're all quite happy, I think, particularly if we are in the political realm and we're thinking about Jesus and outcasts and the marginalised. We're really good on Jesus who loves the poor. The tax collectors are not the poor. The tax collectors are those in league with empire. They are those taking money from the Roman Empire. They are those who are wealthy, who have aligned themselves with Rome. And here Jesus goes and talks to them. And I found that quite challenging. We recently had Helen Painter on our podcast from the Centre for the Study of Bible and Violence, talking about the far right. And I thought it's such an interesting challenge to me. How do I talk to those who are in league with the people that I feel are oppressing my communities, are oppressing my friends? And what does it mean that Jesus is not, that sees them as sinners, but goes and speaks to them? You know, we, like I say, we have certain groups of sinners. So I'd quite like your thoughts on that, I guess, before I get into disability and sickness. And they're credited as those who are sick. So if we're going to talk about healing, pairing these two stories together gives us this idea that there are multiple ways to heal a community, and some of that's physical and some of it's political, some of it's emotional, and sickness is political anyway. But this phrase, it's not the healthy who need the doctor but the sick, gives us a context of sickness and healing for going and talking to those who are in league with kind of empire and power.
Yes, there's something really fascinating there about different groups of sinners, different groups of outcasts, those that are more comfortable for us, less comfortable for us, those who are made outcasts by their own choices rather than by circumstances beyond their control. Simon, Erica, did you have any responses to that?
Honestly, I'm just thinking that the thought is still sort of spiraling around in my head. Obviously, the gospel takes Matthew's name because he's he's mentioned here, it makes you aware that these gospels were produced for different communities because Jairus's name is removed from this version of the story. So we're going back to Mark's version, and Matthew, I'm guessing, doesn't know these people because he cuts the story down. It goes very quickly, whereas Mark makes it a really important story because it's a story about either end of the social spectrum. Uh, Here is a young girl whose father is a respected member of the community. She's at home, she's looked after. Uh, and then we have this woman who is considered to be unclean. She would be a should be a ritual outcast in the community, and Jesus heals them both. He's not. He's one of the things that I find striking is that Jesus really is not a culture warrior. There's so many battles that Jesus doesn't take sides. You know, later on when Jesus is talking about the coming destruction of Jerusalem, he doesn't say, "Oh, you should side with the defenders of Jerusalem," or it doesn't say you should become a collaborator with the Romans. He says, "This is not your fight. This is not the kingdom coming. You need to get out and go to the hills." And so I do think sometimes we need to be challenged that Jesus, there's no point in this story where Jesus says to Jairus, "Oh, you're the people that I've been criticized, so grace is not extended to you." Uh, so for me, there's something there about the universality of God's love and healing. And now I'm just waffling, so I'll stop.
Interesting though that Jesus is happy to call the tax collectors sick. So there's a really great book that I was really helpful to me called "Righteous How to Have an Enemy, Righteous Anger and the Work of Peace" by Melissa Flora Bixler, and I'd really recommend it for tackling some of these issues. Because the question of how do I talk to the tax collector, so how do I talk to someone on the far right, how do I talk to someone that's abusing my community, she tackles this idea of that love doesn't mean not naming what's wrong, not naming what's sick. There's a kind of like, well, if you're going to go and talk to those people, and definitely if you're in some activist spaces, the idea, particularly like how do we bring a Christian ethic to activist spaces? One of the issues is like, what is it to love your enemy, right? Like people want to discard them and say, these people are just beyond help and we're going to fight. So she says, like, it's about being able to name that that somebody is your enemy, they are sick, but also go to them at the same time. And you don't have to give in on either thing. And I think it's incredibly hard work. And it's a hard work to do, but it's really important. And it is interesting of like, how does that... Jesus is going and eating with them. I can't believe that Jesus goes and eats with the tax collectors and doesn't ever mention Rome. It's not go and have dinner with them and never talk about it and just let them be. But it is being in the space. And like I say, How to Have an Enemy is an incredible book. She's a Mennonite pastor in the States, and it was written just after Trump got in the first time. And it's about how she and her black community work with white churches that have voted for Trump. It's really wonderful.
I think it's almost, the only people who are beyond help are the people who are absolutely determined to be beyond help. And Matthew's not like that. Neither are is Jairus or the woman. They're open to transformation. And I think that's Jesus is looking for people who genuinely want to engage with him.
Yes, thinking about what he will have said to them over dinner, I still wish
Yeah.
that we had an actual record of what Jesus said when he went to Zacchaeus's house for dinner. Because whatever he said, Charlotte, like you were saying about naming the situation, whatever he said caused Zacchaeus to change the way that he lived and behaved. So the situation must have been addressed, but we don't know exactly how he went about doing that, which is a shame. Erica, I could see you nodding very enthusiastically. Was there anything you wanted to share in response?
Yeah, I mean, completely. We appreciated the recommendation for the for reading because as part of this year we've been compiling resources for churches to respond to Christian nationalism and the far right, which you can find on our website if you'd like some more recommendations
Brilliant.
yourselves. But I've found it really interesting this year learning about more of the kind of how do we wrestle with how do we love our enemy when our enemy is literally saying something that we
Yeah.
entirely fundamentally disagree with, like, and and they still claim to be Christian, and it's so difficult. So that's a really important point, I think, to draw on. But simultaneously, you should still be held accountable for the things that you say that will impact particularly vulnerable groups of people. And also, I suppose another recommendation I'd like to mention is the work of Better Story. They've been doing some really great things. They're founded by some Christian young adults and have a really great approach for engaging in dialogue with people who are more on the far right or for kind of responding in more Christian ways in this kind of far right activist complicated situation. I think there was a story they've drawn on before actually of a church in Leeds who had the St. George's flag cupcakes at one of the protests.
Yeah, All Saints,
Um,
All Hallows, sorry. Yeah, that was the
yeah,
one.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I've heard them draw on that before. So yeah, I'd just like to shout them out really.
That's some really helpful recommendations. Thank you, Erica. I'm
Can I
aware we
take?
have limited time left, so Charlotte, I'd love to hear your
Yeah,
thoughts on the second chunk of that passage as well.
right. So I'm going to take a disability lens hermeneutic on this. And I think when we preach this passage quite often, we go very hard on her on the woman's exclusion and what's happening there, but from a very kind of physical disability sense. And she's a really good example of the social construct of disability. She's a very good example of how disability is not necessarily about and that disability is fluid through different cultures. So we wouldn't consider her to be an excluded woman anymore. So her physical illness might be hurting her, but she'd be allowed in our churches, she'd be able to go to work. Because of her context, she's an excluded woman. So disability is this social construct. And because of that, one of the interesting things in the parallel between Jairus's daughter and her is that Jairus's daughter has an advocate and she doesn't have an advocate. And so the question for me, if I was preaching it, would be, who in my community doesn't have an advocate, doesn't have a voice? And that's not just about disability, is it? It's about lots of different communities. Because she has to fight her way through a crowd to touch Christ for herself, because nobody's taking down those barriers to get her to Christ. And there's a real challenge in this for me of how do we remove barriers for people so they can access Christ, so that they can get to healing, whatever healing is, and let's put that in heavy inverted commas, because like we've said, the tax collectors are sickle, so healing is not necessarily physical healing. That's a big disability conversation. But I think there's something really important at that parallel between a small girl who has an advocate and a woman who doesn't. There's also another thing that's happening, which is two parallel flows of power. And as she has this bleed, which we're assuming is a menstrual bleed, it's always been considered that, it is removing power from her in lots of ways, physical and societal. It is being lost. And then she touches Jesus and the power flows out from him. One flow of power is disabling and the other is enabling, which I think is a really lovely parallel. But Candida Moss, and I would recommend anybody gets hold of the Bible and Disability, a commentary, which is a big commentary on the whole of kind of scripture, edited by Sarah Melcher. It's an incredible book. Candida Moss, in her chapter, points out that one of the other things we have here is a parallel between Jesus's body as leaky and the woman's body as leaky. And this is one of the places where we see Jesus portrayed in the text as quite feminine. So in the first century, leaky bodies were considered women's bodies and weak. for a body to ooze things, to give out blood, or to have issues of any sort of. Galen, the ancient medical writer, considers those bodies to be feminine and weak. And so here in our text, Jesus is kind of cast in a role of that's normally feminine and weak, but actually enables power to flow from him because it's a physical, and we know it's physical because he feels it. He feels it go. So there's some really lovely stuff in there about how Jesus is being portrayed as a parallel to this woman, and how he has a flow of power that can enable people. But what happens with worldly power when it's given like this kind of bodily power is lessening for her. So those were two things that I really wanted to pick up on. And we definitely need to ask those questions of where are the barriers? Who are we excluding? How do we take them down? Because she should never have really had to do this. That's one of the points of the passage. If she'd had a father like Jairus' daughter, like Jairus, she wouldn't have ever had to do this. And she has to.
I love that challenge to who doesn't have an advocate, who doesn't have a voice. Makes me think of the friends who lower their friend down through the hole in the roof.
Absolutely.
So that he can get to Jesus when he never would have had that access on his own. And who are the people that we're called to offer to do that for? And that's fascinating. Thank you. Simon and Erica, did you have anything you wanted to respond to? I found that hugely helpful, Charlotte. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm feeling moved by the challenge as a man to be more leaky. Um, and in a sense, those of us who have power to be purposefully leaky, to be losing power, giving power to others deliberately, even if other people tell us that we're weak and naive. So just as a man, that's my sort of immediate response.
Love that. Be more leaky. Thank you. Erica.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all so helpful. I don't really have much to add, to be honest. And I'll definitely be using "Be More Leaky" as a snippet for this episode.
Because it's funny that Simon says it that way. I think you expressed it better than me, Simon, because that is what is happening here, is that classically his body, that kind of flowing out of power when someone touched him would be considered weakness, would be just like, this is ridiculous. What strong man gives his power away like that? He must be damaged in some way. And she says, like, it's picked up in Gethsemane, and it's picked up on the cross, and it's picked up when in Luke when Thomas puts his hand in his side. You know, Jesus's body is not the classic male masculinist, a body that never breaks. It's constantly breaking for us, right from this point in Matthew right to the end of the after the resurrection. Be more leaky, let the power flow out.
Absolutely. That idea that Jesus empties himself of all but love allows that flowing out of power to happen, that kenosis, and the sense that it is in that the shedding of blood. The shedding of blood that brings about life and healing and wholeness. But I'd never seen in that passage before that sense of the flow in different directions, and that's just given me a whole new perspective. So thank you so much. Do any of you have anything that you've been burning to share on any of the passages but you haven't had a chance to before we wrap up?
I'd just like to maybe add quickly that if you were focusing on wanted to focus on environmental themes for Environment Sunday, then maybe thinking about kind of loving your enemy as a polluter of oil companies and things like that. But also maybe the Psalm is possibly a good place to explore those kind of themes. The creation of the earth and kind of the global nature of the Christian people, rather than being kind of tied down to nations, like we were saying. And the kind of creative language there.
That's a really helpful note. Thank you, Erica, especially with all those awareness days happening. That's great. Thank you. So thank you so much to Erica and to Simon and to Charlotte for everything that you've shared today. I found that really fascinating. And thank you to everyone who's joined us and listened today as well. We hope that this episode helps you in your preparation to preach and to lead worship. If you've enjoyed this episode, then please do leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Please do share this episode with your friends. And we also have online spaces for further engagement and discussion about faith and politics on our social media platforms and on the JPIT website. Eric has mentioned some really helpful resources that you can find there. So we hope that you have a great week. We hope that this podcast has been helpful to you, and we leave you with that encouragement to be more leaky. Thank you.